Do not underestimate how ugly the world can get and how fast it can get ugly when the U.S. is not engaged, when it's not providing stability in these key regions of Eurasia. The reason the U.S. has the alliance commitments that it has right now is that the World War II and the post-World War II generation had seen the world totally fall apart twice before in the space of 30 years in the first half of the 20th century, because without the United States involved, there was no combination of European or Asian powers that could prevent the bad guys from getting up ahead of steam and running roughshod over Western Europe as Hitler did in 1940. We sort of think that sort of thing is impossible today. It's not impossible, it just hasn't happened because the United States and its friends have worked so hard to prevent it from happening since 1945. Our understanding of how nasty the world can get has been affected and has been distorted by the success of the American order. Trump is right that levels of military spending throughout the democratic world have long been too low. He's right that European countries, I think Germany is the worst offender, have been free riding on the United States while refusing to invest in their own ability to support a collective defense. One of the things that has to be done to preserve this international system that's benefited us and people around the world tremendously is just to bolster the defenses of the democratic world. And that requires higher levels of military spending, yes, in the United States, but also among democratic allies in Europe and East Asia.
Welcome to Open Book. I am your host, Anthony Scaramucci. Joining us today on Open Book is Hal Brands. He's a professor at Johns Hopkins University. He's an expert on global affairs, and to be perfectly exact, he's the Henry Kissinger Distinguished Professor at Johns Hopkins University. We'll talk a little bit about Dr. Kissinger in a second, but the title of the book is The Eurasian Century, Hot Wars, Cold Wars, and the Making of the Modern World. It's an incredible book. You should go out and read it if you really want to understand what's going on in the world today. I appreciate you writing the book. But before we get into the book, tell us a little bit about your background. You say you're in the family business. So what do you mean by that, Professor Brands? You're in the family business.
Hey, everyone. It's Anthony Scaramucci here with some straight talk. Let me tell you, we've got 85% of our viewers who haven't hit the subscribe button yet. What's up with that? It hurts. Listen, I made my career by going all in. Right now, only 15% of our viewers are part of our subscribed family. So please take action. This helps us book more amazing guests. Hit subscribe, join our community, and let's turn these numbers upside down. Now back to the show.
Well, thanks for having me. It's great to be here. I sort of inherited the historical profession from my dad, who's a history professor in his own right and a pretty prolific author. And so when I was growing up, there were a lot of books about U.S. political, military, diplomatic history on the bookshelf. And I guess that's where I got the bug. I'm a historian by trade as well. And so I've spent the predominant part of my career in academia, but I've always tried to keep a foot in policy debates in D.C. and elsewhere. So I've worked or consulted for government a couple of times and generally tried to figure out what history can tell us about the problems that the U.S. and its friends are confronting today.
Okay, so the book, The Eurasian Century, it's an interesting title because, as you point out in the book, there's been more than one Eurasian century. I guess you could argue that most of world history has happened on that landmass, which we say is two continents, but it's really just one big landmass. And so tell us what we need to know about Eurasia.
So you can think of Eurasia as the strategic center of the world. It's where most of the world's people live. It's where most of the world's economic resources are found. It's where most of the world's military potential is located. And so really throughout history, the fact has been that a country or a group of countries that managed to take over Eurasia or big chunks of it would probably have unbeatable power in a global sense. And the reason the period since around 1900 is what I call the Eurasian century is that's when you had technological revolutions, particularly the proliferation of railroads across Asia in particular, that made it possible to move armies more rapidly and at greater scale across that vast expanse than had ever been the case before. And that was sort of the starter's pistol for a series of epic clashes over Eurasia and its key regions: World War I, World War II, the Cold War, And then we're really in round 4 of that today.
So there was a professor, I think he was an Oxford professor. His name was Mackinder. I know you know who he is. You've referenced him. Steve Bannon is somebody I used to work with. I think Steve Bannon is crazy, by the way. I mean, it's my podcast, so I can say whatever the hell I want. You don't have to answer. You can be the diplomat that you are. But he did say something about Mackinder to me, Harold Mackinder, when we were working together in the Trump administration, about his theories related to Eurasia. So
Yeah,
what are his theories related to Eurasia, and how do they coincide or not coincide with your theories?
Mackinder is in some ways the main character in the book. I mean, he's Mr. Eurasia. And so he became prominent in the early 20th century. He gave a lecture that was later published as an article called The Geographical Pivot of History, where he basically laid out a version of the argument that I just made, that Eurasia has long been where the action is, and it was going to become more strategically volatile in the 20th century for 2 reasons. One was with the completion of the Trans-Siberian Railway across Russia, you go from one side of Eurasia to the other much more rapidly via land. But 2, up until the end of the 19th century, the great powers could sort of expand into Africa, Asia, the Middle East with minimal resistance. This was sort of the high period of colonialism, which provided a sort of safety valve, right? If you were Britain and France, you didn't necessarily have to fight each other across the English Channel because you could both pursue your greatness out in the late developing world. But basically, the world had been colonized by 1900. And so at the same time that Eurasia was getting more integrated technologically, it was becoming sort of a more crowded space geopolitically because the great powers were being focused inward on each other. And that was really the core of Mackinder's thesis. He would update it a couple of times over the next 40 years. He lived until the early Cold War, but that was how he made his name.
Yeah, I mean, Kissinger, he was a big student of Mackinder. Nixon was. A lot of the Cold War strategists were worried about a hegemonic power controlling the whole continent, and they liked pitting the Russians against the Chinese. Of course, you and I both know that there's been a border dispute between the Chinese and the Russians over Siberia for the last 300 or so years, maybe 350 years. Yet, the Americans, I feel like the Americans have pushed the Chinese and the Russians closer to each other. Am I missing that, or have the Americans accidentally made them closer?
Well, there are definitely aspects of U.S. policy that the Russians and the Chinese don't like, and that has had the effect of unifying them. I think both of those countries are autocratic great powers that want to carve out spheres of influence in their own region and maybe beyond. Both of them really don't like living in a world that is led by a democratic superpower. And so that creates a degree of glue in that relationship, which appears to be complemented by the fact that Putin and Xi get along and, have long conversations deep into the night with each other. Now, the question, I think, is could or should the United States do something differently to prevent these countries from becoming closer? Because they're definitely cooperating more in the military realm, the economic realm, the technological realm. I'm not sure there's a whole lot the U.S. can do in the near term to prevent that. I mean, what it would take to sort of flip one country against the other is basically letting that country have what it wants geopolitically. So a Russian sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, for instance, and even then I'm not sure if it would work. And the reality is that I think just sort of the structural drivers of these relationships are pretty profound. So I'm afraid that we're going to have to deal with this relationship as a geopolitical fact for the next decade or beyond, even though I think you're absolutely right that there are these long-running historical tensions between them. And over the very long term, if China comes anywhere near to achieving its global ambitions, it's going to pose a much bigger threat to Russia than the United States ever will.
Okay, so be my strategic advisor. I have a declining population in Russia, high alcoholism, 25% unemployment. Yet I'm launching wars outside of Russia to galvanize the nationalism inside of Russia to keep myself in power. I've got a Chinese Communist Party. Now we're going to talk about Xi for a second. Maybe 90 to 100 million people, controlling 1.4 billion people. There are 7 balkanized provinces that I'm trying to glue together to maintain what the West knows as China, but what you know and I know as 7 balkanized provinces that are culturally different from each other. You've got Tibet sitting there as well, which is another big issue for the communists. And then outside of China, or in their minds inside of China, is Taiwan. And so be the advisor to the president of Russia for a moment and tell me what you would do if you're him, and be the advisor to the Chinese president and tell me what you'd do if you're him.
Well, right now,
I caught the grin, by the way. I did catch the grin. Okay.
Yeah. If I were advising Putin, I would tell him that this is the time to cut as advantageous a deal as he can in Ukraine, because he can probably get a deal that will allow him, at the very least, to keep what Russian forces have conquered since 2014. And if he plays his cards right, because it looks like the Trump administration is pretty eager to put the Ukraine issue to the side and do sort of a larger strategic reset with Russia, I would tell him to push for sanctions relief. I would tell him to, offer U.S. energy firms the chance to invest in energy exploration projects in the Arctic, and basically do whatever I could to minimize the Ukraine issue and then maximize the degree to which you create frictions in the West by trying to pull the United States away from its European partners. And I think that's kind of what Putin is doing at the moment. If I were advising Xi Jinping,
before you go to Xi, though, I've got a domestic problem. You know it and I know it. My demography's upside down. The West thinks my country's white, but it's really not that white anymore. There's a lot of demographic changes that are taking place inside of Russia. I can't get the economy started. You guys crippled me with these sanctions. And so, to quote McCain, I'm a gas station with a kleptocracy. But tell me how am I going to fix this?
Well, that's part of the reason why you got to bring the war in Ukraine to an end, or at least hit pause on it. Because if you have to do another military mobilization, the last time Putin did that was when we saw, Russian men between the ages of 20 and 50 hopping the first flight to Delhi or driving across the border to get out of the way. So that's just exacerbating the demographic problem, even before you start talking about the battlefield losses, which are severe, and it's exacerbating all of the economic problems. And so the Russians have transitioned to a war economy, I think, with greater ability than many in the West imagined. But that's not a long-term basis for the Russian economy. And I think there are real questions about how long Putin can hold this thing together. He can probably do it for another year or two, but I don't know that he can do it for another 5 to 10 years. So he's got to find a way of sort of normalizing the economy if he wants to hold the larger sort of Russian political experiment together. And so that's why I think it's a package there.
All right, let's go to Xi.
Yeah. So Xi's big problem is twofold. The first is that the economy is in terrible shape, and there really is not a good prospect for turning it around. And unfortunately, the advice that I would give Xi Jinping for turning the economy around is advice that he will never take. And so the advice I would give is you've got to stop squeezing the economy by exerting ever greater political control on it, right? You've got to allow some degree of spontaneity. That was what allowed the explosive Chinese growth from the late 70s to the late 2000s. And it is the reimposition of almost neo-totalitarian political control that is strangling the economy, in addition to all the other demographic problems and things like that right now. But Xi's not going to do that. And he's not going to do that because he's made very clear that he thinks China is headed into a very dangerous era. And so his priorities are ideological indoctrination, national security, and very tight political control of everything in China. And so I don't think he's going to be successful in turning the economy around. The other thing I would tell him to do, though, is that he may have an opportunity in the years ahead to try to drive wedges between the U.S. and some of its allies and partners. We're only 6 weeks, less than that, into the Trump administration, so it's hard to predict where all this is going to go. But if what we've seen in the last month between the U.S. and Europe is any indication, there are going to be big fractures that open up in what we might have once called the free world. And at the very least, that's going to make it easier for China to discourage, say, the European Union from enacting tighter technological controls, tighter trade controls on its relations with China. And so I do think there's a little bit of diplomatic opportunity there for Beijing.
Donald Trump, is he pro-American? What is Donald Trump? He's for America. He's for the West. He's for democracies, or is he what his critics say, trying to create a tripolar world where he really wants a sphere of influence and some level of heightened executive power in the United States?
Well, I think the answer is yes. I mean, I think that Trump genuinely thinks that he is making America great again, but the version of American greatness he is pursuing is one that is at odds with a lot of the practices that have actually made America great over the last 80 years. And so what the United States has done since World War II is pursued a pretty broad, high-minded notion of national security where we're going to do well by helping like-minded countries do well. I think Trump rejects that. I think he sees the world in zero-sum terms. The U.S. has stayed a superpower in part because we have so many allies and partners around the world, and we treat them differently than we do our rivals. Again, I don't think Trump sees the world that way. I think he sees, every relationship is transactional, and so he's not inclined to give allies the benefit of the doubt any more than he is to give Putin or Xi the benefit of the doubt. And then finally, I think, while this is easily taken too far, it does benefit the United States to live in a world where democracy is widespread, human rights are widely observed. That's just a more ideologically congenial world to the United States. And Trump, I don't think, places a lot of emphasis on those sorts of classically liberal values, because his view is like the world is a snake pit. And so you just got to do what you got to do to survive and to cut the best deals that you can. And it really doesn't matter whether you're doing it with North Korea or with a democratic ally. And so there is a logic to all of the things that Trump is pursuing. But my concern about Trump has always been that he threatens to sort of tear down some of the best traditions of American statecraft.
Did Russia invade Ukraine?
A couple of times, in fact.
Okay, but like the most recent time, starting 3 years ago, they invaded Ukraine?
Yeah.
What do you think? I mean, this is like first grade literature, Professor Brands. In the first grade, my teacher taught me about a book called The Emperor Has No Clothes. And obviously the ending of the book is the young kid said the guy's naked. You have the Secretary of Defense won't say that. You have the National Security Advisor. You have a friend of mine that I really respect. His name is Steve Feinberg. He's the Deputy Defense Secretary of the United States. He's before the Congress, and Tammy Duckworth, who's a U.S. veteran, lost her legs in war, is asking him a straight up question, a yes or no question. Did the Russians invade the Ukraine? And he's not answering it. And so does this worry you as a student of history? Does this worry you as an American citizen? I've read your book, and your book is about values-based diplomacy. Your book is about balancing interests, but also the perilous time that we're living in. You've got 5.7 billion people living under some level of totalitarianism, most of them in Eurasia. And you've got the guardians of this light that Elon Musk has benefited from, and these other people, this liberty and this aspirational story of Western liberalism. And so are you worried at all, or you tell me? Maybe I'm nuts, or maybe I'm nuts.
No, I'm definitely perplexed by this. I think there are a bunch of things going on, and as you noted all the examples of high-ranking U.S. officials who dodge questions about who invaded whom. We're recording this toward the end of a week in which the U.S. voted with Russia against a UN resolution labeling Russia the aggressor in the war. And so it's a pretty remarkable period. So
Yeah,
I think
we voted with North Korea, we voted
that's right.
with China. Yeah.
So we have some friends. I think there's sort of a diplomatic logic to this. I think there is a view among people in the Trump administration that, look, labeling Russia the aggressor, condemning its behavior, fine. None of that helps Ukraine on the battlefield. And so if we're trying to move toward a peace deal, let's try to strip the moral outrage out of this and just see what we can accomplish at the negotiating table. I think that's the charitable view of what's happening. The uncharitable view, which I think is also true, is the one that you've talked about, which is that, once Trump says something, everyone in his administration has to say, well, of course that's true. Of course that's the way the world works. Of course the world is flat, even when it's a patently ridiculous statement to the effect that Ukraine started the war. There is a line of critique among some in the MAGA movement that even if Ukraine didn't start the war in the sense of like sending its tanks across the border, it was asking for it because it was drawing closer to the West, and that was always going to annoy Russia. Yes, Russia was annoyed by Ukraine's ties to the West, but let's not forget that the reason that Ukraine pivoted so hard to the West after 2014 was that it had been invaded by Russia. And so I think there's a real danger in taking that line of argument too far.
Okay, let's pretend that Donald Trump doesn't exist for a second, and I'm going to give you this broad hypothetical. And you have somebody that is a steward of the last American century, somebody that is a student of George Kennan and Dean Atkinson and George Marshall and Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower, has read John Gaddis's literature about the Cold War and is steeped in knowledge of presidential history and steeped in knowledge of the vision of what America is. There's a conversation that's happened from Washington to Lincoln to Roosevelt to Eisenhower to Reagan. And now you're sitting here in this very complex, different world, and you're offering advice to an American president, he or she, that would like to maintain our alliances and would like to grow liberty around the world and doesn't see it as transactional as Donald Trump. What would your briefing be? What would your recommendations be?
I'd probably start by acknowledging the things that Trump gets right, even though he doesn't exist in this counterfactual. I think Trump is right that levels of military spending throughout the democratic world have long been too low. He's right that European countries, I think Germany is the worst offender, have been free riding on the United States while refusing to invest in their own ability to support a collective defense. And so one of the things that has to be done to preserve this international system that's benefited us and people around the world tremendously is just to bolster the defenses of the democratic world. And that requires higher levels of military spending, yes, in the United States, but also among democratic allies in Europe and East Asia. That's thing one. Thing two is I would just say, do not underestimate how ugly the world can get and how fast it can get ugly when the U.S. is not engaged, when it's not providing stability in these key regions of Eurasia. The reason the U.S. has the alliance commitments that it has right now is that the World War II and the post-World War II generation had seen the world totally fall apart twice before in the space of 30 years in the first half of the 20th century. Because without the United States involved, there was no combination of European or Asian powers that could prevent the bad guys from getting up ahead of steam and running roughshod over Western Europe as Hitler did in 1940. And we sort of think that sort of thing is impossible today. It's not impossible. It just hasn't happened because the United States and its friends have worked so hard to prevent it from happening since 1945. And so our understanding of sort of how nasty the world can get has been affected and has been distorted by the success of the American order. And I think that's a prerequisite, understanding that that's a prerequisite for good strategy today.
Okay, I mean it's incredibly well said. Okay, I culled from your book 5 words. Actually, my producer did it, but she does all the work, Hal, and I take all the credit. And I'm going to ask you to respond to these words. I'm going to say them. You can give me a sentence, whatever comes to your mind. Okay, you ready? If I say the word China, you say what?
But peaking and incredibly dangerous revisionist power.
And dangerous because they likely will start a war or have a military aggression, which helps nationalize their interests, right?
Yeah, they have a combination of growing military capabilities and a declining, in relative terms, economic trajectory. Yeah. And that has historically been an explosive mix.
I always thought when George Orwell was writing when I was a kid, I thought that these were warnings, these were allegories, Animal Farm and 1984. I didn't realize they were playbooks for authoritarians.
How-to manuals.
Yes, I didn't realize that. Okay, about Russia. Say the word Russia.
The most violent of the revisionist powers, and one that will continue to challenge European security even after the war in Ukraine ends.
Right. Would the Russians invade Poland?
I don't know that they're going to invade Poland as long as NATO remains intact, but it's not beyond the realm of possibility that NATO will not be intact, and they will certainly do more of the just below the threshold sabotage.
And also political manipulation. They would love to have an election in the Ukraine where they hijack it. Okay, 3 more words. Ready? Iran or Iran. You say Iran, I say Iran.
It is the revisionist power that has been weakened the most over the past 18 months, basically since I started writing the book, because of the good work that Israel has done against Hamas and Hezbollah and against Iran itself. But it's also closer to the nuclear threshold than it's ever been before. And that's the big coming crisis of spring and summer 2025.
Okay. America.
Still indispensable to the global balance of power, still far more powerful and capable than any other country on earth, tied in knots politically, and that is creating a lot of uncertainty about our future course.
But if I were the UK Prime Minister or the French President, I picked up the phone and I called Professor Hal Brands and I said, hey, is this a waning thing, the Trump stuff? Or is the next Democratic president going to act like Trump? You would say what?
The next Democratic president isn't going to act like Trump. I mean, Trump is symptomatic of deeper trends in American politics, but I think Trump is sort of one of a kind in the degree of deliberate antagonism he uses towards U.S. allies, although J.D. Vance is doing a pretty good imitation of that right now. And I also think nobody is going to unremember the Trump era among our allies. But once Trump departs the scene, I actually think there will be more of an open fight for leadership of the Republican Party.
Okay. Last one. Eurasia.
It's where the action happens in international affairs. It is where U.S. engagement is most necessary. And it's also, unfortunately, where we see growing ties between and among all of the bad guys today, not just in Russia, in China's case, and what we've talked about, but between Russia and North Korea, Russia and Iran, China and Iran as well. And so it's increasingly become a place where autocratic powers create these networks of relations that aren't quite an alliance, but are something pretty close to it.
Well, you're a gentleman and a scholar for coming on. The title of the book is The Eurasian Century, Hot Wars, Cold Wars, and the Making of the Modern World. And it's a brilliant book, and I appreciate you writing it. I learned a lot from this book, and even more so talking to you. So thank you for joining us on Open Book today.
I enjoyed it. Thanks for having me.
Now on Open Book, a personal friend, someone I greatly admire, Jay Abraham. He is the author, alongside of Roland Frazier. Title of the book, Business Wealth Without Risk: How to Create a Lifetime of Income and Wealth Every 3 to 5 Years. The foreword is by our mutual friend, Tony Robbins, another brilliant guy, self-starter. life coach extraordinaire, helping all of us. Jay, I know you got a great business with him. Let's go to you, okay, Mr. Business Growth Expert. 5 decades of doing this. It's great to have you on. You're a marketing legend.
Thank you.
Let's start with a little on your background first and how you met Mr. Fraser, Roland Fraser.
Yeah. Well, how far back you want to go?
You tell me, sir. Take us through who Jay Abraham is.
I think the background is interesting because it's not tangential. It has wonderful lessons. So, and you know this because we've had private conversations. So I got started the first time in the adult world at age 18, got married, then don't recommend it that early, had 2 kids at 20, the need of somebody about 40, nobody cared. The only people that would give me opportunity were crazy but interesting entrepreneurs who would be pretty much eat what you kill. They'd give me a piece of the revenue or the deals or the client or the leads or whatever I could negotiate. And because I wasn't time denominated, it was only result based, I jumped around concurrently and did sometimes 5 things at the same time, and fortuitously never in the same industry. I was the accidental tourist. And what happened, Anthony, after about 10 different industries, I realized that people in one industry don't think the same way, don't act the same way, don't strategize the same way, don't source business the same way, don't lead generate, convert, don't do anything the same way, not because one is better or worse. They're very linear, they're very insular. And I was able to take very basic methodology from past industries I'd been in, combine them into hybrids, apply them in new ways to industries where everyone was doing something the same way, same approach, and everything blew up. I did first I did Icy Hot back when it was a mail order company, and we exploded it using a couple of techniques I learned. Then we did Entrepreneur Magazine and exploded. Then I did newsletters, and I got very serious when I recognized the power in what I call funnel vision versus tunnel vision. And then I became obsessed with trying to learn everything I could about everything I could. And then subsequently, I hopelessly, curiously got involved in about 1,000 unrelated industries on a worldwide basis. And that brings me to Roland. So Roland is an interesting guy. I've spent my whole life working on growing businesses, but not working as much on top line moonshots that I thought were very dangerous, but working on 10x bottom line moonshots that really required almost no extra investment or risk. Roland has spent his career really thinking much smarter than I. I've got, and this is just clinical, probably 50, 70, $100 billion of profit increases to my name, and I've made very, very respectable income. But I was pretty inastute. I never really took equities, and I've made people very, very wealthy. I'm not a pauper, but very well wealthy others. Roland, on the other hand, has realized that the real wealth is in getting control of underperforming businesses. He's got some very ingenious ways to fund them and finance them. A couple of the ways are owner carry, but most of them aren't. And then he's got masterful ways to literally exit for what he calls a mammoth payday and an epic exit. I have the middle, the piece that knows how to get, once you get control, to blow up EBITDA for very little or no extra investment or risk. And when I saw that he had a better approach than I, because he's got interest in about 100, it's like a mini little private equity firm of his own. He's got interest in about 150 different enterprises doing an aggregate of about $6 billion in revenue. But in full disclosure, one of them is a real estate roll-up. So you got to back that out because it's probably 3/4. It's still significant. And he's getting massive cash flow, and he's had 3 exits, and the net worth is amazing. And I thought, well, gosh, I'm older, as you know, but I thought maybe I should change my approach. And that was the genesis 2 years ago. And then we started doing this, and it sort of went out of hand. It was going to be a 200-page book. But then I said, well, you got all these ways, and not my sophistication of how to find them, how to acquire them, how to fund them. You got all these ways to exit, but I got all these ways to blow them up. So let's really develop it. And that's sort of the quick backstory.
I love it. It's interesting. My assistant, I read the book, not my assistant, my producer, and Holly basically said, okay, I've got to calculate the number of days you have left on Earth, okay? And she's only giving me 6,205 days, which is 17 years, Jay.
Yeah, but your runway is that much longer than mine.
Which would put me at the ripe old age of 75. I mean, I'm ready to choke her.
Oh, that's funny.
I'm ready to literally. I'm hoping that I can, stay on the planet a little longer than 75. But that's fine. Whatever.
I'm 75.
Right. Well, that's what I'm saying. You look pretty good. I hope I can figure this out.
Thank you.
But let's talk about it. Take my viewers and listeners through being an acquirepreneur and take them to say, okay, here are a couple of steps you need to take to make some money.
Yeah. Can I, and I'm going to ask.
And create some wealth.
But I'm going to ask permission to make a profound reality check, which I think might be a really good foundation that people will think very reflectively on. May I please? Please. Okay. So here's, and you're going to have to straddle this because you're in both worlds. But if you think about it, a lot of people today want to start businesses, and that's admirable because there's a great entrepreneurial movement, and you might need it if your job is outplaced by AI. But statistically, the probability is 1 in 20 startups make it in year 1, 1 in 10 in year 5. So you've got a 5 to a 10% success rate, meaning if you go in debt, you borrow, you put your hopes and dreams, you lose your ass more often than not. So contrastingly, if you find a business that's underperforming but has made it through that, you get control of it, you blow it up, qualitatively, so it's not a manipulative thing, and then you exit in the end of 3 to 5 years, you could create the income or the wealth of a lifetime in that period. Your lifetime, your wealth, not necessarily your wealth, my wealth, but with somebody's relative or more. And then you do it over and over again. You rinse and repeat. But the better part for me, because I'm not really as much into startups as Roland, if you own a business, any kind of business, this is what I love, Anthony. You can grow it conventionally. You can have great marketing. You can have great strategy. You can have great this or that. But if you add acquisition to it and you do it astutely, you can acquire competitive businesses, of course. You can buy product service companies people buy the product of before, during, after, even instead of what they buy from you. And you might go, well, why instead? Well, a lot of people get leads they don't convert. A lot of people sell something that is short-lived. If you, for example, Anthony, were selling, not that you would, a supplement for weight loss, the average person might take it for 4 months, and most of them don't. They're very vigilant about their protocol and regimen. They don't lose weight, so they either stop that, buy another one, or go to portion control food, or buy equipment, or get a trainer, or buy recipes, and you've already got the sunk cost in finding that person. So you can be masterful in a lot of ways you don't think about, and then probably more inventive. And I wish I could give credit to myself. This is Roland's. You can buy access vehicles. What's an access vehicle? It's a podcast like this, if I wanted your audience. It is a blog. It is a discussion group. It is a sales force. You're going to laugh about this. I got a client that is trying to do a roll-up in logistics. A lot of little mom and pop, $5-10 million logistics. And some of the owners have an inflated idea of what it's worth. But what has happened is oftentimes the owner of a small business like that starts out, he or she is the salesperson. They're doing all the work, and then they get some momentum, and then they hire salespeople. Then if they do pretty well, they become the golfer, or they become the whatever. They don't even know their clients. You can just hire the sales force for a fraction of what you pay for the company, and you get 80% of it. So it's very enlightened thinking, if that makes sense. Now to your question again.
Well, listen, I mean, it's very, very thoughtful. You also know a lot. I mean, you're almost like the Pope of relationships. Okay. And so tell us about, and you write about it in the book, so obviously share your thoughts in the book, why relationships are so important. And in many ways, relationships are really the story about creating wealth without risk. Because if you're with the right people, you're taking on less risk. Well, tell us about that.
Well, and I'll go to my own background. So I learned from masters that if you go in the outside market and you get a prospective buyer client, it's a cold, untrusting person that you have to work your heart out, and it's very arduous to convert them to first level trust, which isn't necessarily committed trust. Even when you get first stage committed trust, it's sort of like that. Whereas if you find people that already have hard won the trust, the credibility, the direct access, you can go to them and you can end up getting an immediate sale, an immediate buy-in. You can get a much larger transaction. Give you a couple of suggestions. In the beginning of the halcyon days of financial newsletters, and I'm dating myself, gold first became legalized, Jesus, I don't know, in the 70s or 80s. And all the gold dealers out there were selling in the Wall Street Journal. They were selling on Forbes. They were just running ads, and it was arduous and it was very expensive. I realized that the real market were the hardcore conservative people that were subscribing to all the newsletters. I went to all the newsletters and I made my gold client the recommended provider. We ended up, every time there'd be a new subscriber, we had our materials in the new subscriber kit. 4 times a year, we paid to do a special edition of the newsletter on the outlook for hard assets. We would fund in their name events regionally that their editor and our president would go to. Bottom line is we went from $300,000 to $500 million in 2 years. Now, admittedly, it's a small margin, but it's still profound. I was in the seminar business when I was younger. Everyone else was running ads. I basically did $250 million, $250 million, and I ran about $300,000 of ads. I got Anthony Robbins to do it. I got the newsletters to do it. I got the seminar companies to do it. I got Entrepreneur to do it. They put the full force of their access, their media, and then I put the fixed cost on the back end and only paid them in direct proportion to revenue that was in my bank. I mean, there's a great saying, and I think you'd like this. It's called the Rothschild story. Supposedly somebody years ago wanted to borrow $100,000 from Baron Rothschild. He said, I won't lend you a penny, but I'll do something many times better. I'll walk hand in hand back and forth twice across the bourse, the stock exchange, wherever it is in France or UK. And when we're done with the second walk, everybody there will loan you all the money you want. That's the personification of the power of it. And, you can do enormous things. I used to have, when I was in the seminar business, I used to have operations in Singapore, Australia, Malaysia, Vietnam, China, Italy, the UK, and I never put a penny out. I would just find other people that already had access to the entrepreneur audience, and I made them partners, and they got a share, and they did all the heavy lifting.
Well, listen, I love you for so many reasons, but the one that inspires me the most are the obstacles. So how do you get through them? How do you fight through things like that? You are somebody, I have a lot of resilience. I've been fired from the White House. I've had ups and downs in my political and business career. But there are certain principles that you've distilled from the masters, let's call them the masters, on resilience and dealing with obstacles. So what are they, Jay?
Well, the first one, and I can tell a great story that I think it embodies it. The first one is that your problem is always going to be the solution to somebody else's bigger problem or opportunity. You just have to figure out who it is and what it is and how to make sure it's articulated. And I'll give you a simple story because I love storytelling, and you and I both know that metaphorically the brain works better. So when I used to do seminars all over, and you can stop me anyway because I go on a tangent, and you can just intervene and go stop. When I used to do seminars in Asia, the first time I ever went to one of the countries, I do this 3-day, very expensive seminar. At the end, I always did through translation Q&A. So this guy comes to the mic, and through translation, he goes, "What do you do if you're too small and the bank won't lend you money to grow?" And I said, "Well, okay, tell me more." And he goes, "I'm a small local motorcycle manufacturer in China. I don't deal with China anymore, but we did then. And only in China where you got 100 million population, would you literally have a small local motorcycle manufacturer?" He said, "If I had the money, I'd go all over Asia. I'd find a city, open a big factory, hire salespeople in every country, recruit dealers." And I said, "Okay, what's the problem?" And he got very frustrated through translation and went, "I told you they won't loan me money." I said, "You don't need money. You just need to figure out what you're the solution to. Go all over Asia, find somebody who's got a complementary business that's not competitive, but has already got a huge factory that's underutilized, has salespeople, has dealers and partner with them. And it took me 2 minutes. The next time I came back a year later, he comes to the mic. I'm trying to underscore my point. I hope I'm not being tangential.
Not at all.
He said, I did what you said. And I said, what'd you do? He goes, I went there. I went all over Asia. When I got to Malaysia, KL, I found the largest lawnmower manufacturer. They had a huge factory, underutilized second shift. We made a deal. I had to bring tools and dies. It's just the metal that forms the parts that make the assembly that produces the product. And he said they had representation in 10 countries. They had offices, they had salespeople, they had thousands of dealers. He said in our first year together, we both netted $20 million apiece. So the first thing is slow down. Somebody else probably has a bigger problem or latent opportunity you could solve. The second is because I have been involved in over 1,000 industries, not businesses, I've seen optionality that blows your mind. Most people, I created something called funnel vision as opposed to tunnel vision. It's predicated on the fact that you have an infinite number of ways to do anything, but you probably don't have the exposure to some of the higher, faster, safer ways to do it. Most people get frustrated. They get disenchanted. They get turned off. They get stymied or constrained because they only have a certain number of options in their reference base. So I'd say to everybody, you got to expand your knowledge base of what's possible because there's a lot more ways to get at it and there's a lot more steps. And that's the second thing. I would say, I remember a book that Fran Tarkenton wrote years ago, right when he had done a public company that blew up, and it was called Failure is Not Permanent. It really isn't permanent. I remember reading another book. It said, that when you're down, you're only down for the count if that's the way you want to be. You have free will, and there's plenty of ways. Another thing, this is very important because a lot of young people don't know this. I've had all these mentors. I have knowledge because I had the good fortune of being in a lot of industries, but more importantly, I've helped over 300 of the top world experts, and none of them came to me for help with their methodology, but I had to learn a distillation. So I got all these wonderful integrated knowledge. But somebody who was a mentor of mine once said when I was young, because I was very, very, very aggressive and I could have gone to the dark side. And he said, you can lose your money, and if you keep your integrity, someone will always back you. But if you keep your money and sell out your integrity, you'll never get it back. And that was a profound statement. I've always tried to really contribute. And I've been driven by trying to support people who were on a mission or a crusade to bring true value creation to others and what it really meant, whether it means filling a void, whether it means bringing a level of product service or frictionless transaction to people. So I don't know if I'm giving you tangential answers or relevant ones.
No, listen, it's very helpful. And I think the point about integrity can't be overstated. You can have a lot of mistakes in your career, but if you live your life with high integrity, you're always going to have opportunity. You've been called the 21.7 billion man. Let's go there. What is that about? Tell us about exit strategies.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it is actually, it was years ago. We tried to calculate and we just rounded down because rounding down is neater than rounding up. It's probably 50 or 100 billion now, but we tried to conservatively estimate the people we knew we had impacted, and we tried to very conservatively compound it and then discount it for the ones that probably didn't sustain it, were out of business. I've had a blessed career. I've been all over the world, figuratively, not to every country. I've been involved in about every conceivable kind of industry, and I've had impact and very. It's a great pride. I've probably impacted. Lots and lots of experts, lots and lots of consultants, lots of entrepreneurs. It's funny because I was in New York a couple of months ago, that, and I was helping a client of mine. You're going to laugh. It's the largest duck provisioner in the country. They do $250 million of ducks to all the Asian restaurants, 80% of Asian and about 70% of the Michelin. And And he grew from 30 to 250 million using 5 concepts. We have lots of stories like that, and we wanted something that would shock people's attention. Back at Exits, just to stay with the book, because you're being very, very respectful and honoring my side of it. The book is all about the fact that if you go at the conventional, by the way, if you do it right through acquisition, you can take a business that has got a low multiple. You can blow it up both in earnings and volume and take it to a much higher multiple level. And, I've got a client of mine, they got dental practices. He's done what a DSO does, or is it DSO? He basically buys individual ones for a low multiple. He puts it in with his group of 40, and all of a sudden he's just raised the multiple X times. We did something really hilarious one time. I was doing something with Tony, Anthony. You'll get a laugh out of this. And we do Q&A together. And this is to his high-end people. And somebody came to the mic and said, Tony, I sold my business for a much higher multiple than the business was worth. And I've got a look-back deal where I get the same multiple on all the volume above the base level I can produce for the next two years. How can I grow it? And Tony and I both said the same thing. Don't try to grow it. Acquire ones for 3x if you can get paid 8x. But a lot of people try to make the solution harder. I have a metaphor that I love, and I'm throwing things out. You can stop anytime. But I was profoundly impacted by the first Indiana Jones movie. And I was more profoundly impacted by one scene when Indy was being chased down the bazaar by the bad guys somewhere in North Africa, and he was trying to escape and slipped into the alley, and you thought he was safe, and then all of a sudden it was a dead end, and there was the 7-foot giant spinning the sitars and looking like Indy was a goner, although it was only 20 minutes in the movie, so it probably wasn't going to happen. And after about 10 minutes of pensive anticipation, he took out a gun and went, "Whew, stop that shit." And I think it's really important that you have options. You can change the game anytime you want.
I love that movie. I've actually loved all 5 of the movies, even the one where he's playing the 80-year-old Indiana Jones.
Yeah.
Which is another statement about life. You're as old as you feel. The book calculated me out to 6,205 days left. So I don't know. I don't like that about the book. That's probably the only thing I didn't like about the book. Everything else I did. I want to talk to you about growth.
Please.
Okay. How do you grow a business? How do you grow yourself? How do you expand and stay neurally plastic at any age?
It's interesting. I'm going to answer you 3 ways if I can. I'm going to go back in time, and I'll be current, and then I'll go future. So I was vividly impacted many years ago reading a book called A Technique for Creating Ideas. It was written by a guy named James Webb Young, who was he ran, I think, J. Walter Thompson's whole creative side when he was back in the 50s, a long time ago. And he wrote a book because all these magazines, when magazines were the most viable form of advertising, would go to him to come up with a great idea to sell out this month's edition, and he'd give it to them. But when they didn't have an idea, it would peter out. And they asked him, how do you create great ideas? And he thought about it, and he wrote this little book. And what he said, the first thing is, and I'll come to the answer to the question, I'll come at it with a progression. He said, the first thing is, your mind was created. Its job is to solve problems and create opportunities, but it's got to know what it's supposed to do. So the first thing is tell it. Then he said, the next thing is take in all the information you can about everything you can on that subject, everything you can on that subject. And he said, but the real key then is taking all the information you can about everything you can off that subject, because breakthroughs are going to come from outside your industry, not inside. And I used to talk about this. I haven't for a long time, so let me dust it off. So if you think about it, fiber optics that transformed telecommunication didn't come from telecommunication. It came from aerospace, and it was borrowed, extrapolated. Either the ballpoint pen or roll-on deodorant borrowed the mechanism from one another. Viagra came from from a heart. Rogaine from pimple. FedEx borrowed the spoke and hub check clearing system from the Federal Reserve Bank and how they cleared checks overnight. The most successful baby buggy does $300 or $400 million is the collapsible wheels. So I think you got to be able to travel outside your comfort zone in terms of knowledge and understanding. There was a book, you probably read it. I don't read as much as you, and you're voracious, but it was written by a guy named Epstein. It was called Range. Did you read that?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, actually just had that book in my office. I just gave it to somebody. It's a great book.
It's a great book, but I think the premise paraphrase is the people that are going to own dominance in the second half of this century are the ones that have the most range, because hindsight, even insight, isn't the same. There's dynamisms coming on that takes a whole different kind of thinking. Also, in answering your question, I think there's 9 forms of thinking. I don't remember them all: critical, deductive, inductive, strategic, all these things. Most people only have one of them. Another thing you can look at is pattern recognition. I'm in awe of Tony Robbins. There's 9 or 10 forms of pattern recognition, and he's almost all of them. I had somebody assess me, and I was about 8 of them. But the more you can see patterns and extrapolate, the more power you have. And I don't know if I'm going to the right answer to your question, but on growth, if you do the same thing the same way everybody else does it, number one, you're only going to get an incremental growth. You got to do what they don't do in ways they don't do it, and understand. I've always said there's 2 kinds of entrepreneurs, and I deal with entrepreneurs. You deal with more corporate. There's a 2D and a 3D. A 2D entrepreneur thinks in terms of revenue minus expense equals profit. A 3D looks at the value of the asset residually. What's the return they're going to keep getting continually on investment? They look at everything as an investment: a lead, a salesperson, distribution channel, everything. And they have a greater advantage because they're playing a longer game. So that's another way of doing this. A lot of times people don't understand, they understand allowable cost, but they don't understand how powerful it can be. When we did Icy Hot, and I'll go back way in time, but it was hilarious. It was a mail order product originally, and we bought it out of bankruptcy. It was only doing $20,000. We were going to basically just use the equipment from the business, but we did an analysis and found that the average, anytime we got 10 buyers, brand new, it was only $3 a bottle, a jar. 8 of them bought almost every month forever until they died, or somebody came up with a cure for arthritis, bursitis, rheumatism. Of the 8, almost half bought a second product every month. Of the 4, and this is average, 2 of them would buy bulk every 2 or 3 months. And the bottom line was, every time we got 10 buyers, even though 2 never repeated, and they paid $3, we were making $50 net profit a year on that person. And we had no marketing budget. My job was to go to radio stations, television stations, media, and get them to run ads when they had unsold advertising, and gave them all the money, and we paid them more than all the money. And people thought we were crazy, but we built 500,000 repeat buyers in a year doing that. So it's understanding the lifetime value, allowable cost, looking at yourself as an investor, learning what your competitor doesn't know. It's also understanding preemptive advantage. One of the things in the book that I love is there could be a business that seems like a dog, and it is by itself. But if you get control of it, it could have multiple advantages. One, it can access a market ahead of everybody else in your generic region, something people buy before, so you have a preemptive advantage. 2, it can be something you can use as a less foreboding way to start a relationship, an easier way to get people to start. 3, it can be something you add to your typical sale, which might be only a modest amount more revenue, but it might double or triple the profit. 3, it might be something expensive you add after they bought everything else, and it might double or triple the lifetime value, which, if you just look at it in profitability, is one thing, but it could double or triple your allowable acquisition cost, meaning what you can invest, not spend, to bring in a buyer in the first place. So I think the bottom line I'm trying to say is you got to think differently than everybody else.
Well, I think it's brilliant. We're at the point in the podcast where I'm going to read 5 words, and then the author is given the opportunity to say a few things. You can say one word back or a sentence. It's sort of like a Rorschach test on what's in the book. So let's start with wealth. What does wealth mean to you?
Well, to me, it is a definition of a couple things. Certainly, it can be economic, but I think it's satisfaction, fulfillment, purpose, possibility.
There's a happiness quotient to wealth as well, right? Just the fulfillment.
Absolutely.
Right?
And I think that's something that there's a flaw in a lot of people, because they're obsessed just with achieving economic. But I think it's an integration of things. But yeah, I think it's many forms of compensation, tangible and intangible.
Success.
Success is I think the ability to feel that you've accomplished something meaningful at the not just the level you're capable, but that you've stretched yourself and you've left the world better off because you were in it.
Failure.
I think failure is an illusory concept because when you don't succeed, you're learning what not to do next, or you're learning to reevaluate your belief system. I don't think failure, I think it's an illusion. I think it's a very positive if you don't risk too much.
Death.
Well, it's interesting. At my age, in my mortality, I think death is something you don't think about when you're young. You first of all get gripped with it when you're older, and then you celebrate the fact that it's inevitable. So you might as well enjoy the process to the fullest while you have the chance.
Okay. So, it's a clarifying mechanism that focuses you to, in some ways, make your life more meaningful, right?
Yeah. You've never been to my office, but it's smack dab right in the center of the Torrance runway. It's not on the runway, but it's not even a street. It's just a road. And the planes go right over us. And it's a great metaphor because my runway is a lot shorter than yours. And then you relish the day. You take
not according to this book that you wrote. Okay, when I do this calculation,
I got to do real calculation.
Great. It's like unbelievable. I'm yelling at my producer as soon as this is over. Okay, my last word. Okay, you ready?
Yes, sir.
Acquirepreneur.
Yeah, an acquirepreneur is a definition that we have given to somebody who doesn't try to start from scratch, but they grow at an outsized, almost an exponential level through acquisition of businesses, resources, assets, and knowledge. But it's about really recasting how you see yourself and the way you create success. And I don't know if you read it, the subtitle of the book is How to Create the Income or Wealth of a Lifetime every 3 to 5 years. And the hypothesis is, why work a whole lifetime and have X when you can have multiples of X, and every 3 or 5 years you can get what you would normally get in that duration. So I think it's designed to dramatically shift your worldview.
Did I mention failure already? I mentioned failure, right?
You want to talk about it some more?
No, I like the failure. I love you on failure, by the way. The fact that it's like not permanent. You know what I mean? I just love that whole messaging related to failure, because ultimately that's it. I mean, my message, if I could go back in time, or let's say I was in a classroom setting and I said to somebody, well, what was the big idea? For me, the big idea is to keep going.
Yeah.
Remember what Churchill said, when going through hell, keep going.
Yeah.
So what you got to do is just keep moving, right?
Yeah. And what do you say? Never, never, never give up. I mean, I think people, they take it as a personal effrontery. It's you made a one of the things I learned a long time is, if the assumption driving something is wrong, that everything flows from it wrong. But if you rethink it and say, okay, what did I learn from that? What am I not going to do that way? What did where did I err in my assumption? I think everything is a growth opportunity. And if you do that, you celebrate living at a much more, it makes it intoxicating and far more liberating and fun, don't you think?
Totally agree with you. Listen, you're a man of the ages, man of letters, a brilliant guy, lots of fun to talk to. Title of the book is Business Wealth Without Risk: How to Create a Lifetime of Income and Wealth Every 3 to 5 Years. And it's fabulous. And, I look forward to spending much more time with you, Jay. And congratulations again on the book. And thank you for joining us on Open Book.
Thank you for the privilege of sharing. I adore you. I think you're one of the finest people and one of the most mammoth minds I've ever met. Thank you very much.
You're a good